Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am very honored and excited to be able to moderate this very, very crucial panel, U.S.-China relationships. We know how important it is to actually keep track of the recent events, and I have the honor here to introduce very honorable speakers, starting with Mrs. Elliott, Her Excellency, who has been serving as ambassador for many years and is now President and CEO of National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And I have the honor from the other side to be able to introduce to Professor Andrew Leung, International Independent China Strategist, and we will talk together on the Chinese perspective, of course. There will be a vivid debate, I am sure, and a lot of interesting comments from your side as well, I believe. And the third speaker, I have the honor to introduce you to Mr. Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council from the U.S. He is as well an expert on regional security in the Middle East and in Central Asia and Russian Federation. So he will, of course, be able to give us his point of view on these regions and on the intelligence agency that he has been working on. And later on, we will be able to welcome the rest of the speakers. But of course, I would like to introduce a little bit better the whole subject. We already know from the media that in the recent years there have been a lot of deterioration from U.S. and China. And there are a lot of rise of tensions in the Indo-Pacific due to the trade war, which was actually inherited by Trump era. And of course, the Washington allies in the Indo-Pacific are coalescing in the Quad, a group consisting of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And this organization will be reinforced by the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was suggested by President Biden. This partnership consists of 14 countries and includes the Quad states, South Korea, and some Southeast Asian and Pacific Islands countries. So China has privileged the relationship with several countries in the region, and in addition, Beijing is continuously increasing its military presence in the China Sea. I can mention here the Chinese former ministry spokeswoman who has issued a statement on China's activities, and to quote, China's activities are mainly for civilian purposes, but also are intended to serve necessary military defense requirements. So this is the first time that China's government has acknowledged the land reclamation activity is intended, at least in part, for military purposes. We do have Admiral Yin Zhuo, who wrote in an article on the South China Sea for the main activities are for communication and for monitoring. But anyway, there have been events such as the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight, and this is where actually some rescue responsibilities have been cited as to respond to a possible threat or to possible accidents. So, of course, there are many questions that we want to answer today. I stated here some of the tensions between the two countries and some other countries which are already trying to be in alliance with one great power or the other, but yes, of course, we need solutions as well. So this is why I'm very excited that among our speakers, there is not only this willingness to highlight the problems, but especially to be able to give some solutions. Mrs. Elliott, I do know that during your proposals and your objectives, you will mention as well some of the solutions so far. So please, if you can give us, first of all, a highlight on this, we would like to know more. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Moderator, and I think you've accurately outlined a lot of the challenges, questions that are faced for the countries of the region and around the world, and a lot of it is related to the status of the relations between the U.S. and China. You know, the U.S. and China are the two largest economies in the world, and if their relationships are rocky, it has a spillover effect to countries especially in the region, but beyond. So, and arguably, or not arguably, but you know, U.S.-China relations are probably at one of their worst points since 1979, when when the U.S. had diplomatic recognition of China. And so what I'd like to talk a little bit about, because many of you don't know, but you know, we look for solutions. Sometimes track one, or government to government, are not really working hard to find solutions. So the organization that I work for now, and to tell you, I used to be a U.S. diplomat, and now I've retired, and I run an organization that has, since in the 1990s, conducted track two discussions. We have track two discussions, which are informal among experts from countries, dialogues, to look for ways to air our problems, but then also to find solutions, to make recommendations to the respective governments. So, for example, we have a U.S.-China strategic dialogue, but one of the main dialogues that we have that does affect U.S.-China relations is our cross-strait dialogue, where we engage trilaterally with scholars and experts from mainland China, and as well from Taiwan and the United States. Now, of course, the pandemic really made it difficult for lines of communications to be continued. But we successfully have been able to, which we didn't think we'd be able to do, but continue those dialogues virtually, and now we're on the verge of being able to go back and start to talk. We're based in New York, so we bring scholars. At least before the pandemic, we bring scholars to New York, and then we also take delegations and go to the region to have discussions. So I would just say one of the things that I think is important to look at is that the importance of dialogue, and having been a U.S. diplomat, and if I go back even to one of the things that the Obama administration did, where they had the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, and I think one of the things that my organization did is kind of review what came out of that, and looking for ways to say that dialogue, not confrontation, is the best way to go. And I think we found when we engage that it helps to stabilize things like the international financial system, and you can work through things that are of interest to all countries, but especially U.S. and China. But the climate change, and looking at how to respond to pandemics. At that point, they were looking at the Ebola crisis in Africa, but I think it shows the importance of collaboration. And we not only do U.S.-China, but we also focus on discussions about North Korea and the North Korean nuclear situation. And I think that's an area where, in my opinion, that U.S. and China, and with Japan and Republic of Korea, should be working together to try to come up with solutions on the best way to deal with North Korea. And I just will close a little bit by saying that Brookings recently came out with a report about U.S.-China relations. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is they looked and said that the U.S.-China relationship of rivalry really isn't constructive, and that, it's better to look for ways that we can collaborate. I know this is difficult, doesn't mean we have to agree, doesn't mean that the U.S. acquiesces to China or China acquiesces to the United States, but in looking for ways to, instead of competing, but, are there ways where we can collaborate and both sides strengthen their technology. Looking at business, I mean, business and trading with China, that's one of the reasons I think that the U.S. has been involved in it. It's a huge market, and both the Chinese want to be involved in the European and American markets and vice versa. But also looking for ways to just find how can we responsibly talk and have a durable and good relationship, because if we don't have a good relationship, the spillover goes to, for example, Republic of Korea, where China is a great trading partner. So do we want countries to have to choose among friends or enemies, or do we want to look for ways that we can all collaborate and cooperate together? So I think I'll stop there, but I'm interested in really hearing the other panelists' point of view.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Elliott. In the meantime, I welcome the last speaker who just joined us, that I will be able to introduce later. But yes, it is true that one of the solutions suggested by President Biden actually is crucial and needs to be analyzed more. And we could see, on the other hand, and this is where I would have the question for Professor Long. The visit of Mrs. Pelosi actually raised a lot of tensions. So it was seen as a provocative action, actually, by Beijing. So I'd like to know a little bit more about this. And of course, I'd like to ask you for some possible solutions between this rivalry between the US and China, and how it can be, are we really heading towards a new Cold War? Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join this august panel at a time when the whole world is facing existential threats and paradigm shifts involving mainly the two powers, rivalry, a confrontation, if not a total crash of values between the United States and China. First of all, I'd like to say something with reference to the fact that I'm referred to as an independent China strategist. Because from a young lad, I could barely speak English, and I loved America. The first book I read on the United States is The Little House on the Prairie, and I borrowed from the library in the city next to Hong Kong. So I'm a great admirer of the United States. And also suffice it to say, I was the only Chinese invited for a one month round the United States tour to share my views on Beijing beyond Tiananmen Square in 1990 as an international visitor. Okay, so coming back to this current situation, I think there is a great misunderstanding on both sides on what China wants. Does China want to rule the world? Is the 100-year marathon, as espoused by Michael Pillsbury, the 100-year marathon to displace the United States? Does China have the full capacity? And I stress the word full. That means it's not only the military, it's not economic, it's how to manage all the countries in the world towards a more benign and more sustainable model. Would many countries like to embrace communism? So this is a total kind of misreading of China, because what China wants is really the so-called China dream, is to restore China's place in the sun, and not as a hegemon, but to be respected as a civilization and a very important role to play in the global system. So that's the one misunderstanding. The other misunderstanding, perhaps on the other side, is that perhaps the United States can perpetuate the U.S. hegemony forever. In other words, Americans continue to call the shots on all things at all times, and using America's great advantage. One of the greatest advantages of the United States, of course, is blessed by nature. is separated by 2 oceans. And then the north and south border are all friendly countries. It's very rich in natural resources, unlike China. And it's, of course, the world's largest military with 800 bases around the world. China is no way can replicate that. But then the fear is that somehow China would erode the so-called American hegemony. I think that this is also a misunderstanding. The second misunderstanding is perhaps that China could be totally decoupled. In other words, creating a bifurcated world, which is no good for the world because this disrupts supply value chains with kind of blowback, with a kind of fallout for the rest of the world. So again, it's unsustainable. And in fact, during the trade war, and even during the first phase of the pandemic, China's economy continued to grow rather than decrease. And in fact, foreign investment flows into China continue to grow during that period. So that explains the sustainability of China's economy, because it's simply becoming too big and too intermeshed into the rest of the world. So that translates into how we're going to manage these things, because the value systems are totally different. I think the comparison with the past, with the fall of the British Empire, with what went before, is not really on par with what's happening now. For the first time in history, we're seeing a different civilization, perhaps a different race, and different culture, ideology, posing an existential, perhaps not existential, but substantial and strategic challenge to a world order led by the United States. So to avoid a kind of confrontation, the Thucydides trap, we need to come up with solutions. And in fact, President Xi himself already highlighted before the Party Congress the so-called 4 traps China is facing. The first trap is the Tacitus trap. For those who are not familiar with Roman history, Tacitus, Tacitus, is Roman emperor. The so-called Tacitus trap is that when a regime, when an ideology is not trusted, then no matter how good, how well it performs, how benign it becomes, it's not trusted. So that's called the Tacitus trap. The second trap, of course, I referred to already, is the Thucydides trap, when the 2 Greek powers confront each other. In 12 out of 16 cases in the past ended up in war. The third trap is the middle income trap, and China is facing the demographic deficit, more and more old people, because the demographics are worsening. And then translates into lower productivity. So China is now facing the stress either. And the fourth trap is added by Joseph Nye of Harvard Kennedy School. It's called the Kindleberger trap. No matter who's sitting on top of the world, if it's the capacity to maintain the world system is somehow become deficit, insufficient, that is no good. It's no good for the legitimacy of whosoever becomes the global power. So all these kinds of dynamics translates into what my colleague was saying, that we need to develop a model. How? We can talk about it, because it needs to be realistic. There are so many stakeholders, domestic, international, regional, culture, values, tracks, formal track 1, track 2, whatever. I think this is a very important forum. So I like really to not only to jostle with my very able and distinguished friends on the American side, but to really look forward as to what would become a more sustainable model. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, from one side there have been many political statements that not necessarily politically China wants to replace the US, nor does not have the capacity to do so, not the willingness to do so. So, but yes, there are some tensions. They are real. They are there. So we wouldn't even try to question them for as we speak now in this panel. So this is why I believe that our dear next panelist, Mr. Berman, can offer us his perspective since he has been working for CIA, many other agencies, and he can give us a little bit of his feedback on the possible cooperation as well. I believe that this panel is very interesting since we do have both sides. So please, to you the floor, Mr. Berman.
So thank you. Just to clarify, consulting, not working for, because what you're going to hear is, because when I don't say these disclaimers, people get very irritated with me when I go back to Washington. So this is just my view. But I actually, I think, I appreciate what the previous speakers have said. And I think it's actually necessary to look a little bit at where we are, where we were, and where we're going, right? You have to understand the arc of U.S. policy in order to understand how America thinks about what it now calls great power competition. I think it's a useful exercise. So let me just focus on that. Focus on the past, focus on where we are currently and where we're going and sort of what the challenges are. So the last half decade has seen the demise of an idea which in Washington is known as the responsible stakeholder paradigm. I'm sure some of you have not heard of it, but I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It's in Washington, it's very, very popular. But the basic idea of the responsible stakeholder paradigm is that the greater integration of China over time into multilateral institutions, multilateral financial institutions, multilateral governance institutions, would make it a more responsible player on the world stage, would essentially give it more of a stake to behave responsibly in the post-World War II international order. This is the idea that's governed U.S. policy for decades. I would argue it's actually been the dominant approach that America has taken towards China ever since Deng Xiaoping took over for Mao Zedong in the latter half of the 1970s. But what we've discovered over the last several years is that the bargain has not worked out the way Washington has hoped. It's certainly true that the People's Republic is interested in being involved in these institutions. China is not a hermit kingdom. China is involved on every level in every multilateral institution. But it's also not correct to say that China has absorbed the idea that it wants to be part of the US-led international order. In fact, there's lots of evidence to the contrary. And so what you have in America over the last several years has been this dawning realization that the bargain that we thought we were striking with Beijing is a one-sided bargain. And so you're seeing, and this was first articulated by President Trump and it's sort of codified in his national security strategy, which came out in December of 2017. But it is an idea that has transcended administrations. And it's an idea that is subscribed to in somewhat modified form by the Biden administration. So it's necessary to point that out because this is not a partisan evolution. This is an evolution that has taken place in the American body politic as a whole. So that's where we were. Where we are is that we're witnessing the rise and the implementation of what has come to be known as great power competition. And the shift that I talked about, the ideological shift, underpins this move from cooperation with the PRC to competition with it, along a whole spectrum of disciplines, whole spectrum of fields. These areas, and this is underpinned, unfortunately, by this understanding in Washington that the areas of potential cooperation with China are constricting, and the areas of potential competition with China are expanding to include things like artificial intelligence and cyber warfare and space dominance and a whole host of different things. What you have in Washington increasingly is gravitation to the realization that we are approaching a systems clash, a clash of systems, of values between the Western-led democratic order and the model of managed prosperity that is promoted by the People's Republic of China. And this has been exacerbated, by the way, by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the lessons learned, the things we learned about the fragility of supply chains, of economic overdependence on China, for example, for goods and services. So all of this is adding fuel to the propelling great power competition. So that's where we are. Where are we going? And here, I think very much, speaking as an American, the glass is half empty. America likes to talk about great power competition. But America doesn't really do great power competition well. We have as of right now, We have no countervailing grand strategy to sort of provide a compelling alternative to the Chinese model in places like Africa, for example. We have strategies that are intended to counteract certain parts of Chinese foreign policy, things like the Blue Dot Network, which is intended as a partial answer to the Belt and Road. But increasingly what we're seeing is that, at least under this administration, that focus on competition with China is subordinated to other priorities like climate change, right? So I'll tell you guys a little story because I think it's instructive. The Biden administration last summer was on the cusp of a fairly significant decision. It was deciding whether or not, as a result of significant U.S. concerns about the human rights situation in Xinjiang in Western China, which multiple administrations, successive administrations have condemned, the Biden administration was trying to figure out what to do in terms of a retaliatory administrative action. Significant, if not the vast majority of China's solar power industry is located in Xinjiang, in the same province. So the Biden administration hit upon the idea of sanctioning Chinese solar power companies, right? Sort of banning imports of Chinese solar solar panels from Chinese solar power companies as a result of the human rights concerns. However, a very furious debate ensued at the National Security Council level in the Biden administration, and the end result was that not all 13 of those companies were sanctioned, but just one of them was sanctioned symbolically. And it was because the climate change team run by former Secretary of State John Kerry prevailed in their argument that what you need to do is you need to balance. If you do this comprehensive sanction, China will be less likely to cooperate with you on things like climate change. And so what you have, the image that emerges, is that, at least under this administration, you have this notion of managed competition. And the term has sort of taken many forms. We started with great power competition under Trump. It became long-term strategic competition at the start of the Biden administration. It is now managed competition. But these are not interchangeable terms. They reflect changes in American policy. As different priorities rise, and as the need or the urgency of competing with China sort of comparatively declines. And that's where we are. But I would note that because of the depth to which the American body politic has sort of woken up to what not our China problem, I don't think that's the correct word, but the strategic challenge that's posed by a rising China that we are trying to figure out. This is an enduring problem. It's going to be a problem that persists across administrations, right? It's going to persist long past the Biden administration, and is going to be accelerated by things that China does that Washington feels that it must respond to, because fundamentally, where we are heading, our policymakers believe, is this idea that you have two distinct models. And we are operating in very much a sort of a proto-Cold War atmosphere. I hate to say it, but it's sort of a proto-Cold War mentality where we are carving out spheres of influence, and we believe that China is doing the same. So this is the glass half empty read from Washington, but I think it accurately reflects sort of the state of where relations are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berman. Indeed, there is so much room to discuss about the common areas of cooperation between the countries. So I would actually ask the same question, and I am at the same time having the honor to introduce to you to Professor Mark Ellenberg. He is foreign policy advisor and an entrepreneur, philanthropist, and he is part of many editorial boards of scientific journals. And well, actually, I would like to ask the same question, since you already heard your colleagues mentioning the areas of cooperation. So what is the U.S. stance on this, and especially with Biden administration? Did something in particular change concerning his point of view towards the relationships between U.S. and China if we compare it to the Trump era? Thank you.
Cheers. Elon and I have known each other for about 1 billion years. No, well, yes, I do think it's changed, but not actually so much in substance, but as in tone. And I'm not sure I agree with that tone. I'm trying to imagine a world during Soviet times where we would have offered to make production sites somewhere deep in China, Russia, and help them get technology and help the Soviet Union produce products and help the Soviet Union get a whole series of things, microchips, you name it. I think that idea is ridiculous. China's government is corrupt. They murder people every year. If Germany, the country I was born in, dared to even neuter one woman, and it would be disgusting to do that, China does it with millions of people, and nobody cares. The prison system is the principal backbone of their production sites. They run around offering a series of values that are a poison chalice and want us then to negotiate with them as though they were equals. They are not equals. They cannot be equals as long as they refuse to be part of the way the world should look. Does that make me sound like a missionary? Well, maybe it does, but I think sometimes you can advocate for things and advocate for certain values and certain ethics of which China has zilch. And when you look at how they have behaved in Africa and how they have invested and how they treat the local workers, which is they don't really care because they bring in their own, I don't see why we should even be thinking about sitting with them at a table and negotiating. They're not worthy of our negotiations until they have decided to change the pattern of their behavior. And so, of course, China is a complicated place. It isn't just one little country. It's got 1 billion point some odd people, and the areas are very different. It's like saying New York is California and California is Texas, or, sorry, Algeria is Morocco. We know those subtleties matter, and sometimes they're not so subtle. But this kind of idea that China wants to force us into let's sit around and do patty cake together is something I reject completely. I've rejected it for 30 years. I rejected it in the first years of the Clinton administration and thought it was an absolute big mistake to begin to warm up to China when we were dealing with the fall of the Cold War. And my idea then, as it is now, would have been to invest in the stands in Central and Eastern Europe, many whose countries have lost their way, even Russia. And so what do I think the Pax Americana relationship with China is? I think it's abysmal, and I don't like it. But I'm also not prepared to sit down at a table with somebody who is not worthy and who has proven to be corrupt and criminal, a whole series of things, and then tries to present it to me as it's in your best interests. Because it's not. Thank you.
Long, would you like to respond to that?
I always enjoyed a tussle, if not a jostle, with Mark, who's one of my Greek friends. First of all, I think, as I said before, there's a great misunderstanding of what President Xi wants, what China wants. Now, the biggest misunderstanding is somehow the Chinese Communist Party is illegitimate. Now, when I was a young lad, I didn't like the Chinese Communist Party at all. But then, despite its name, the party has changed substantially in terms of bringing much better lives for the entirety of the Chinese people. Look at the past 40 years. The lives of all of the Chinese people have been miraculously changed. And then lifting so many people out of poverty. And then according to the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center report, which was only out, say, last year, and then they looked at the longitudinally at countries around the world as to which government is most supported by its people. I think it's a continuing exercise. And they found that the Chinese people, the Communist Party government, is most supported by its people, almost nearly 90%, if not over, compared with much lower ranking a lot of democratic countries, including the United States. Why? Because the legitimacy and the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party is in fact that they can carry the people along. Don't forget Mao Zedong got where he was and won the battle because of a people war. And it brought all the people along in confrontation with the very corrupt Kuomintang. And then in the beginning, of course, the Communist Party wasn't corrupt because there's nothing to corrupt with. Now, the second, so according to the Harvard Kennedy School, the Chinese Communist Party government is most supported by its people. It's almost 90%. That's the one dimension. The other dimension is that, yes, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is corrupt, remains to be corrupt, and hence the anti-corruption campaign staged by President Xi, which has been misrepresented as President Xi's grab of power, as if President Xi is a product of an internal domestic revolution for power. Nothing of that sort has happened. You can look at the data. In fact, there is after Mao Zedong, there is a sort of party consensus as who is best to be the leader. And even now, after the 20-party Congress, in spite of the noise of what happened, sort of the sudden exit of Hu Jintao and all, this is noise. Because the reality remains that there is no systemic kind of rivalry within the party. Otherwise, all the big boys in Wall Street would retreat. And you can see, as I said, even during the Cold War, during the trade war, during the early stage of the pandemic, there was even inflow of capital into China, and China's trade increased. So that's another misunderstanding, that somehow Xi Jinping is part of the corrupt regime and is using the anti-corruption campaign to seize more power. Because why? I mean, it's already very powerful. And then, of course, the great misunderstanding is what the China dream wants. As I said at the beginning, China, learning from all these periods, is in no position to challenge, to replace the United States as the global leader. One important thing is that not a lot of countries would embrace communism, right? Even though that China is very, very strong. But then I think that what China wants is to be respected as an equal or as a near equal. In fact, according to many studies done in the United States, highly respected think tanks, that China is a near peer competitor. What does near peer mean? So, yeah. So anyway, obviously all these problems need to be managed, and I think we can talk about it later.
Thank you. Actually, I'm enjoying to see two different approaches. From one side, it's the American approach, very bold, very straightforward. And on the other side, yes, the Chinese approach, which would be much smoother. And actually, I would like to ask a question to basically both of you and to all of you, since yes, I do come from neither of these countries, so I feel a little bit more neutral to do so. And I've been discussing with a lot of African colleagues, either from Morocco or other countries deep down in Africa, and we've been talking for years about the Chinese investments. And I come myself from a country which needs desperately a lot of investments. So I do understand the need, the urgent need, right here, right now, from the African side. The infrastructure, they desperately need it, and the Chinese are there to invest it. And there's an expression, all magic comes with a price, and actually, all these investments, they are not donations, they come with a price. And we all do know this. I've seen many examples. One example may be Sri Lanka. And we all know that African countries will never be able to pay them back, to pay to China back. So they will be somehow losing the sovereignty of their territories during the years for at least many decades to come. So, but yes, as we speak right now, they are happy. So what would you answer to the people, to the citizens who are living now, right here, right now, and they want to see some changes in their lives, and they can see that other powers, or even France, for example, and so on, they're failing them. So what would be your answer? Well, if you can... Yes, please.
Well, I would just say, first of all, I agree with what Mr. Berman said about what the U.S. policy has been since 1979 toward China, and I do think that opening up to China was an idea in our mind that it would change, it would bring them more into the international system and change perhaps the communist regime. But, that hasn't happened, and I guess I would say that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to engage with them, because I think your question is a good point. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and what it's done for poorer countries, developing countries who need infrastructure. I mean, I was U.S. ambassador in Tajikistan, and a lot of the infrastructure projects that the Chinese did there, you could say, well, they were needed, and it isn't development, it's their commercial transactions. And eventually, what will happen? These countries are indebted to China. But I guess my point would be, from the U.S. perspective, by why not then engage with China? I think one of the other panelists mentioned the Blue Dot Network, but, as an American diplomat, what did we have as an alternative? If I need roads built, if I need other things done, and someone's offering me a way to do it, then I have to seriously consider that. So I guess that, to me, is an example of why we need to continue to engage with the Chinese, because perhaps there's a way that we could engage in looking at development and working together with them on alternatives to what is just strictly one way, the Belt and Road Initiative, which may not be the most attractive way for developing countries to accept aid, but it may be their only alternative at a certain point. So to me, that's an example of why we need to continue to engage with China on, this would be one really good issue to discuss.
Please.
All right, and I apologize in advance if I run a little long. I have lots of ideas sort of bouncing around in my head. But so I think the first thing is to point out that, there's this phrase in English that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And this holds true for Chinese investment as well. And we're beginning to see this on this continent, where there are countries who really don't have alternatives, right? We can talk about sort of the lack of a fully formed American strategy, but because they don't have alternatives to Chinese investment, they become over-leveraged, right? Blame it on their local governments, blame it on the lack of alternatives, but the end result is that some of them, and you can point to places like the DRC, for example, as a result, encounter an erosion of sovereignty. Right, where there are natural resources that are nationalized, that there's a greater Chinese stake than those governments are comfortable with. But staying on the topic of the Belt and Road, I would point out, from an American perspective, I'm worried about two things. Right, China has figured out a very robust, a very comprehensive plan of internal social management. Right, we know it externally as the social credit system. Right? The idea that your standing in Chinese society is relative to your allegiance to the party, your outspoken nature, your political views, right? And it tends to govern things like your freedom of mobility, whether you can rent an apartment or afford a mortgage, your ability to travel, things like that. What I worry about, as someone who watches this region and watches the Middle East and also Central Asia, is that the Belt and Road is very clearly becoming a conveyor belt for China to export those technologies to other parts of the world. The idea, right, so the Chinese model has worked within China to create conformity, and you're beginning to see the sort of the beginning strains of it leaking out of China and migrating to Africa, the Middle East, and other places. And as a Democrat, small d Democrat, not big D Democrat, I worry about what that does to the complexion of this region, of neighboring regions over time, right? Particularly when you have local governments that are inclined to take this technology because they're staring down the barrel of massive youth demographics. They need Chinese assistance to modernize their economies and their telecom, right? The appeal is I think, overwhelming. The second is that, unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has learned that Chinese investments have bred silence from the Muslim world, right? because what you're seeing in, and again, I say this as an American, where the last administration and the current one has both agreed that what is happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is classified as a genocide. I'm a recovering lawyer by trade. I teach international law. The Genocide Convention of 1948 specifies genocide as the willful destruction in whole or in part of any ethnic, sectarian, or religious group. And what's happening to the Uyghurs, I think, very squarely fits in that definition. It may not be politically correct to say so, but I think it's necessary to say it. And by the way, international bodies like the UN have migrated in this direction as well. There are other governments like the UK and China and Canada that have said so as well. Who hasn't said so, really, is any country in Africa, any country in the Middle East. The conspicuous exception is Turkey. Turkey was an early objector to Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. All of that ended in about mid-2018 when the Central Bank of China gave a $1 billion infusion to the Turkish economy, right? And since then, it's been, as we would say, crickets. And the problem with that is, right, I mean, we can talk about human rights, we can sort of have that fulsome conversation, but I think the political lesson that this is teaching the People's Republic of China is very detrimental. It is that Chinese money is buying Muslim silence. And I think that's not a lesson, that's not a moderating lesson, and it's something that I'm very concerned about. And so that gets me to the last point that I want to make, which is whether or not this is popular, right? And the problem that we in the West very often have is our understanding of China, we think, is absolute. Developed Western economies talk to each other about how we're worried about China, and then we think that 100% of the world thinks exactly the way we do. And that's not true. And so there's a tremendous amount of pluralism in how China is viewed. The best way I could describe it is America, with its talk about democracy and human rights, is the aspirational power. There are many governments, although not all, that want to follow the American model. But China is the present power. China is present on this continent, and China is building stadiums, it's building railroads, it's investing in infrastructure in a way that the United States and Europe simply aren't. And that's the imbalance, I think, that is the top priority for American policy to correct.
Thank you very much. Professor Ellenbunk, would you like to answer?
You know, I think asking us to sit at a table with China is a little bit like asking a rattlesnake to negotiate with a mouse and assume that they're going to be equals. And the presumption that we somehow need to recognize a government that's proven to mistreat people and to abuse people and to have a prison system that's tantamount to none in terms of its brutality, in terms of what it does, doesn't mean we need to hate Chinese people, and we should not. And we shouldn't let this turn into bigotry and racism, but there are clearly systems we should want to exist on this planet and clearly systems we should not want. Und als Deutscher, dessen Familie im Zweiten Weltkrieg nicht so richtig auf der richtigen Seite war, as a German whose family was not on the right side of history during World War II, except for mine who left and went to Canada, I get very concerned when we get presented a series of things that we consider good, when totalitarianism, which takes advantage of us, or when, a pimp is supposed to be the labor union representative for a prostitute, comes along and tells us that we should be listening to them. And I apologize for the brutality of my language, but I am dead serious about my feelings about the brutality of the Chinese system. And it is like presenting us with an apple in the Garden of Eden that looks and smells good, and at the end we realize that we're going to be poisoned by it. So how do you have to react? Well, first of all, the European Union needs to step up to the plate, and it needs to start investing in this part of the world. Also, the United States and Canada, as they've begun to do. Second, your own countries need to dump some of their corrupt habits and start investing in local communities, building up hospitals, building up schools, trying to make equality, understanding that Islam is a complicated and old religion that has a different way of seeing the planet, but there are still things that one can have whether children should be born safely, whether each person should have food on the table. And you don't need to take out corrupt Chinese loans to have that happen. Your country, in this case Morocco, other countries are able to do that, but you've got to find a way to disperse the money in a way so that not just 1% of the people are owning 90% of the wealth, and then you don't have to run to an evil, corrupt banker. And I don't mean Andrew, he's a good man, but still over the years our opinions have changed a bit, especially since China's taken over Hong Kong. And so, you just need to be careful, and sometimes one has to wait. Just because you meet somebody in a restaurant and you think they're going to be your husband or wife means that they're going to be the one who's going to be in your life. Sometimes you have to meet 5 people before you realize it. So it also takes patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will be gathering a series of questions from the public, and because actually, and then you can answer in the, if you can introduce yourself and then to whom your question is directed, please. One, and if somebody can bring the microphone, please. Thank you.
Hello, I am Khalid El-Kamili from business school here in Tanger. My question is why we consider China like an evil? Why we take this word like an evil? Why we don't think another word that consider China like not an evil, but what Mr. What you can defend this word of evil?
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, I see some hands. If not for them, yes, please. And the third one there. You can introduce yourself and say who
Hello.
to whom. You
Can you help me with the mic?
it's
Yeah,
working.
it's working. My name is Yassine Al-Mokadam. I'm an independent consultant in foreign direct investments and compliance, financial compliance. And I have a question to Professor Long. How do you see China's future engagement with the world in terms of conflicts resolution? Because I heard that, I think it's a few weeks ago, President Xi said China was going to play its global role in the world. And if you can articulate on this, thank you very much.
Thank you. And third question, please. Yes,
Mon intervention
please.
sera en français with French.
Yes, we do have translation, so you feel free to ask in French. Oui, s'il vous plaît.
D'accord. J'attends M. Lou, c'est parce que je vais m'adresser à Louis. Voilà. Nourdine El Kadouri, je suis enseignant, visiteur et chercheur. Et d'après M. Long, il a parlé que la Chine cherche le respect de la civilisation. Et je crois que...
Excuse-moi, on n'a pas une traduction, en fait, si c'est possible de traduire. Est-ce que c'est le numéro 2 it's... Yes? Okay. Thank you. Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Et le respect, cherche le respect et le respect de la civilisation. Donc, je crois que le respect se fait soit par la force, soit par l'entêté, ce qui ne dispose pas la Chine. La Chine représente 50% du budget militaire par rapport à celui américain. Et pour l'entêté, je crois que les droits de l'homme font encore faute pour être à pied égal avec les pays occidentaux. Donc, si on analyse un peu la diplomatie américaine depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, on comprend bien qu'entre les lignes, il y a une ligne directrice. D'accord? Et je crois, j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur la guerre commerciale sino-américaine. J'ai vu les chiffres américains et je crois que la Chine cherche, bien sûr, à être une suprématie mondiale. Et d'après les chiffres, je crois, en 2035, il peut y arriver. Donc, c'est un enjeu qui menace la paix mondiale du moment que la Chine dépasse les lignes rouges qui ont été mises après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. J'ai déjà, pour la question de la civilisation, j'avais l'occasion de croiser l'ancien ambassadeur chinois au Maroc. Je lui posais la question, pourquoi vous n'exportez pas votre modèle politique et culturel qui correspond aux pays du tiers-monde? Parce qu'il y a une grande similitude entre la gouvernance du Parti communiste et bien sûr le pays. Il m'a dit que ce n'est pas de chasesse. Et je crois que la force des États-Unis, c'est dans son soft power. D'accord? Donc, quant au hard power, c'est le deuxième lieu. D'accord, voilà, merci.
Merci beaucoup. On va répondre aux questions, s'il vous plaît, professeur.
Well, thank you for allowing me to respond to a number of very important questions. First of all, I think about democracy. And if you look around the world, there are many types of democracy or even, how to call it, benign authoritarian regimes. Most authoritarian regimes are not benign, okay? But there are some authoritarian regimes which are more successful than the others. And as for human rights and democracy, even the United States has got Guantanamo Bay, right? But it doesn't mean that the United States is an authoritarian country. And of course, with Black Lives Matter, this highlights, and also the United States is the highest incarceration rate, number of prisoners on a per capita basis compared with the rest of the world. I'm not saying this as an aspersion against the United States. Of course, there is no comparison between the kind of model, soft power of the United States compared with China's. What I'm trying to say is that it is not a black and white thing. As for the export of technology, technology itself is neutral. It's like a knife. You can cut an apple, you can cut an orange, you can use it to murder other people, right? So I think that it is incumbent on the countries, recipient countries, to safeguard their own model and to be vigilant. But the import of technology itself in a fourth industrial revolution does not automatically translate into exporting China's system. In fact, there is no evidence to suggest that China can export a system. As I said before, no one is going to embrace communism, not in a lot of countries. But I think that the model China is trying to show is that China's model is not necessarily exporting authoritarianism. You can achieve the same result with democracies, is to achieve the well-being for most of the people, and not just the people in support of a winning party, right? Or in support of the vested interests of a winning party. So I moved to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think China has learned a big lesson in the blowback against the Belt and Road, particularly in terms of indebtedness. The poster child is not so much in Africa as in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka lost the control of the Hambintota port because they simply can't repay their loan. But that's to say that China deliberately wants to do that. I think is a bit going too far, because according to a very in-depth study by the John Hopkins University, the most highly esteemed foreign policy university in the United States, Professor Broderston, a lady, has done a series of studies on the indebtedness of the African countries and around the world in receipt of China's loans. And she found that before the loans arrived, most of the countries, of course including Sri Lanka, the poster child, have been heavily indebted, but the African countries still want to get more loans to grow their infrastructure, to build more hospitals, schools, highways. because that's the way that countries can empower themselves rather than receiving aid, because too much aid results in aid addiction, as also pointed out by Dambisa Moyo in her epical book. So that is the thing. But I think that both sides to learn a lesson. I think China is also learning how, before the loans become fruition, I think China is now working more with international institutions like the World Bank and other stakeholders with its Belt and Road. It is a learning curve. But to say that China uses that to export communism, its own model, is, I think, is a travesty of truth. As to what's happening in Xinjiang, as I said, I mean, you have got to multiply Guantanamo Bay maybe 100 times to understand what China is doing, because there's a separatism happening in China. And as for Hong Kong, I come from Hong Kong, I live there, and that's not the end of the world. And of course, what happened before the enactment of the national security law is because of these years of so-called protests, but they're violent protests, people throwing petrol bombs, holding the law and order to ransom. The police headquarters were surrounded. If you think that this could be allowed to happen in the United States without the police firing real shots, I mean, think again. But after the enactment of the security law, things have returned to normal. I mean, we're really freely to express ourselves. Of course, as I said before, there's no comparison Hong Kong before and after the handover, but we still enjoy a high level of freedom, and international businesses come. And as we speak, there was an international conference of the world's top bankers, converging on Hong Kong in spite of the pandemics. And this highlights the important role Hong Kong's got to play. And one defining feature of Hong Kong is Hong Kong still practices common law. What's common law? It's based on British law, the common law, because it underlines the one country system formula, which is beneficial to China in the long term. Here I stop.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, there is no doubt that China doesn't even need to impose itself ideologically, and that is not even the purpose. It has all the trade power in the world, so it can very easily do so through trade. So, yes, communist part and ideology, it may be quite frank and quite clear that and many countries are over the ideological part. So since there were some, more very beautiful question, I mean, from a young person who wants to see these two powers even, so, or, to see this share of the power. So do you have some answer for the first question?
Well, I don't think I even mentioned the word communism when I was speaking. I just have a problem with systems that are corrupt. And they can be communist systems, they can be democratic systems. Of course there's corruption in the United States. It's abysmal. And of course it should be fought. But I do believe that when you're in a system, the playing rules should be the same, and in China the rules of engagement are not the same. They are not the same for everybody. And there are exceptions to policy made for senior members, and on and on and on. I mean, is that a system you want to live in? Where you're being told what to do, how to live, you can become a worker drone like in Star Wars movies. That's a great life to have. And that's exactly what the Chinese system is offering you. And I think we shouldn't want that. And I don't think we should respect it or tolerate it or put up with it. Andrew's a great guy. The Andrew that would have spoken to you 5 years ago is a different Andrew than speaking to you today. I'm sorry, that is my opinion, even though I like him. And so when this stuff gets into us, I mean, what does China do when it gets our technology? It reproduces it. First it takes it, throws out the companies that have gone in there to produce, from Nokia to you name it. It's just a continuation process. And so us living in a bad way, not having food, not having a chance to take care of our kids is all true. But there is still a place, and there should be a place, for not accepting regimes that want nothing but to incarcerate us. China doesn't care about individuality. It cares about the collective. And it masks that in giving people an opportunity to have wealth, to have a car, to have a house. with the parameter being this wide and this part controlling it. And it's true. I think you have to choose whether you want a competing system in your world. Which one do you want? And I do not believe they're equals, and I do not think we should see them as equals.
Yes, indeed. I would like first to take another question from the public, if there are. If not, I would have some questions, since we do have remarkable speakers who actually came up with some proposals, and one of the main questions is actually, where are the main common areas of cooperation? Is it even possible? And I do know that Mrs. Elliott is working in an organization which is offering and proposing mechanisms to do so. So Mrs. Elliott, and then I'd like to hear a little bit more from Mr. Berman as well on the possible cooperations.
Well, thanks. And I don't disagree with a lot of things that the other panelists have said, especially in terms of corruption. I mean, there's corruption all over the world, including in, as Mark mentioned, in our own country. But I guess I would disagree with, or maybe pose a question to him, is that, so if we don't want to engage, which I think we should engage, because if there's corruption everywhere, so then what do? We retreat within ourselves and not engage with others. I think that the best way, to me, of trying to make change is to try to, to engage, and engaging on things that maybe we have similar interests on, like climate change, as I mentioned. Like, I know that the pandemic was not, to me, handled well by the U.S., by China, by a lot of countries around the world. And in terms of, even we heard about this yesterday, vaccine distribution, and that the developing countries weren't able to get the vaccines like the United States was. So I guess I would say that we need to look for, and we can't look for these ways if we don't sit down and talk about, well, what kind of common ground, do we have? I just don't agree with, if someone is corrupt, you don't talk to them, because to me, having been a U.S. diplomat, most of the conversations we had, maybe we weren't always successful. Obviously, we haven't been successful in a variety of things, but we always brought up human rights issues and other kinds of issues. And I do think, I forget who said it, but that many countries aspire to be what the U.S. is, but it's a process. I had my friends from former Soviet Union. I spent most of my career working on Central Asia, and a lot of, not all, but a lot of people said, well, it's a process, and if we're moving in the right direction, I think that's important. So I would just say I'm for engagement, and I don't...
climate change, for example?
Yeah, and climate change would be one. Perhaps we can talk about even in decreasing proliferation, but even of nuclear weapons, but then looking for, are there ways that we could have some kind of a dialogue on trying to prevent or learn lessons on how we could prevent a future pandemic. So, but I don't disagree that there are many challenges, but I would say in terms of the U.S. engages with a lot of countries who do horrible things and are corrupt. But, and we do, again, we have corruption in our own country, but we need to look for ways, I think, to talk to our enemies.
Yes, of
or
course.
not our enemies, I don't mean our enemies, but our competitors.
Or, well, geopolitically, the definition of enemies is present, it is used. So we are actually used with such a language, but not in a bad sense anyway. And I would like from Mr. Berman first to identify some of the common areas specifically where there may be cooperation.
So I knew you were going to ask me that question. I'm sorry to disappoint, right? So in my presentation, I made the point that the areas of potential cooperation are constricting and the areas of competition are expanding. And I think that's true to the extent that I actually think that it's not even reasonable to talk about cooperation on climate change. Not because the lip service isn't being paid to climate change. It's being paid to climate change in Beijing. It's being paid to climate change in Washington. But in terms of Chinese, if you look at Chinese patterns of energy consumption and of production and the reliance on dirty fuels like coal, the sort of importation of oil from the Middle East and things like that, my sense is that this is only a bounded conversation. This is not a game-changing conversation. I remember a few years ago, this is actually, I think, an important example to highlight because China is central to the climate change conversation. I remember standing a few years ago in the train station in Nanjing, and there was, in the middle of the afternoon, it was pitch dark, and there was smog up to my knees in the train station, right? From industrial pollution, from dirty coal, sort of consumption of dirty coal, right? China, in terms of its population, is a game changer in the climate change discussion, if it is a key participant. But I think we have to be realistic. I think we have to be realistic about how China calculates the equation, right? At the 20th Party Congress, which just concluded, Xi Jinping made a point about talking about his priorities for a stable and prosperous China, his priorities for sort of expanding the China dream. Climate change did not come up in that presentation.
Beautiful China includes climate change.
No, a beautiful China includes climate change, which is a nice slogan. I don't think that there's a lot of concrete thought being given more to climate change than to prosperity, than to economic expansion, right? So again, here, this may be an area where we want to cooperate, but I think we have to be realistic about the potential for real, tangible progress in a way that doesn't diminish the other side. Because it's very clear that the Biden administration has made climate change its overriding foreign policy priority. I'm not sure that that overriding foreign policy priority is matched by any of the other governments that it's engaging on this issue.
Yes, indeed, and China made it very clearly many years ago that, yes, it wants to have the possibility to produce as much as possible and to develop as there was a chance for the Western allies. So, in a way, yes, China made it clear that, yes, now it's my turn. So I would like to ask the Professor Leung on this and, of course, on climate change, since there was no
Well, I think that facts speak louder than rhetoric. Who is leading the world in wind power capacity? Who is leading the world in hydropower capacity? Who is leading the world in solar power capacity? You know, and then, you know, sort of China, of course, is the largest polluter because of the sheer size of its population, because it started from a late stage in its development. And in the early days, China had to rely on coal, but no longer, not because of, you know, blue skies and polar bears and a nice future for the children and children's children in the Western rhetoric, but because of national security. Because if China imports energy from the Middle East and from the other countries, it will have to pass through the Malacca Strait, controlled by the United States. It will have to pass through the Red Sea near Iran, events beyond China's control. So China is on the trajectory to a cleaner future because there's a rising middle class in China. In fact, with the high-speed rail connectivity, most of the countries, the cities in the world, in China, would be connected by high-speed rail. And then that would grow China's middle class to 800 million by the year 2050. And the aspirations of the middle class, of course, are very, very different. As for corruption, of course China is corrupt. And that's why Xi Jinping is very, very strong in attacking corruption. You can sit there and twist it and say, oh, this is only seizure for power, because corruption is at the very heart of the legitimacy of the communist regime. But of course, it is said that there is not a black and white situation. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There's no one Coca-Cola formula as to how other countries should run their own people. If you look around the world, what about the Middle East? Is the Middle East a democracy? Is the Arab countries democracy? So all countries are different. And coming back to the common prosperity narrative, I think it's both an internal narrative and an external narrative, because China has become a very, very unequal society, even more unequal compared with the United States. As years of unbridled capitalism, borrowing so the American ultra-capitalist formula, and then with the result that a lot of people got rich first, according to Deng Xiaoping, but that's translated into a highly unequal society, rattling the stability of the Communist Party. And that's why China wants to have this common prosperity agenda, not in terms of Robin Hood. No, this is a complete misunderstanding, is to grow more and empower the small guys to grow their own small businesses, bring along more sustainable jobs for more people, and making the, and then also constraining the huge kind of conglomerate dominated by the IT, sort of big guys, and narrowing the field of the small guys. That's common prosperity, because that would sustain the narrative of the Communist Party, which of course is equality for most people. Now, in the international sphere, and China always promotes the idea of common prosperity, common destiny for the world. I mean, you can say that this is communist rhetoric. But then the idea behind it is that each country's geographical, historical, cultural, economic situation is different. It's just like your family. How you run your family is very different from mine. Why should there be one formula for all, imposing to all countries, including Saudi Arabia? You know how Saudi Arabia runs its own country. It's their own. They've got to take into account their own internal dynamics. But that doesn't mean the whole world cannot be moved forward. Now, coming back to what I propose, because the conflict, because there's no end to it. If we just push China further and further, it's just not going to be regime change. As I said, most Chinese people, vast majority, over 90%, support the Communist Party because their lives are totally transformed. Okay, there will be less, the freedom in some sectors, but, so what? I mean, that's just like Hong Kong. I mean, compared with what happened before, you can say that I can say all sorts of things, but now I'm still, free to say a lot of things. But everything is relative. So what I propose is that instead of this binary dynamic, say I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're evil. And this is a kind of very simplistic kind of rhetoric. And then the two sides would really come together. Well, you can say that I sit on a high table, you sit downstairs. It doesn't matter. You come together. The model I'm trying to say is that I'm not proposing a G2 because G2 is very, very alarming to a lot of countries. Is that there should be a informal dialogue, multi-track dialogue, both official and non-official, NGOs, think tanks, so that to thrash out some of the problems of a crash value system and the crash dynamics.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Berman has a response, and after this, I will ask to all of you to wrap up in one or two phrases on the possible diplomatic avenues between the two countries. Thank you.
Okay.
Please.
Well, I can hold my my comments in reserve. I'll keep that in my 1 minute, unless you want me to go now. I mean, I can. So I thought the professor's explanation was, I think, very good, because what we're actually talking about here is this trade-off between prosperity and individualism, the constriction of the public sphere in China, which has mirrored this very laudable, very dramatic economic rise in the living standards of Chinese citizens, right? And this is the bargain, this is the trade-off that is now being promoted by China through its engagement with other countries, right? The Belt and Road is a vehicle to promote Chinese engagement, but it's a vehicle also, in its most benign sense, to upgrade the living standards of the countries that's involved in. But it comes with a price, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. And so that trade-off that you're seeing in China, in terms of conformity versus individual thought, in terms of a managed society versus a free society, right? That is not an insignificant thing. And as we Americans say, it's coming to a theater near you, right? Because as China expands globally, right, very clearly there are going to be choices that your individual governments are going to need to make about how much of this model to absorb, right? Again, right, China can't foist the model, but China can present the model, right? And your governments can decide how much or how little to engage in this model. This is, I think, where the big challenge for the United States and Europe comes. the absence of not just there is a countervailing sort of Western liberal democratic model, but the absence of concrete engagement and solutions and thinking about common prosperity is, I would say, less refined and less mature than what you see on the Chinese side. I know which model I would prefer, right? But I'm not sure that my government is in a position to promote it as compellingly as it should right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So please, to all of you, if you can wrap it up very quickly, like what may be the diplomatic avenues on a cooperation? Please, if you can start with you, Mr. Ellenborg.
It's Ellenbogen, by the way, not Ellenborg. Ellenbogen, like the woman's name, Ellen and Bogen written together. Look, I've been negotiating for over a year to stop trying to have Mr. Putin go into Ukraine. You can see where that works. And I said then, last summer, that this was going to turn into war. Very few people wanted to believe me. When he flew into the Olympics and met with Mr. Xi, gee, I wonder what they were discussing there, whether we're all going to have democracy. No, they were talking about how to divvy up Taiwan and Ukraine. And Mr. Xi believed that Mr. Putin's comments about this is going to take me 2 weeks are true, and now regrets it. So yes, I do think regimes are not equal. I do believe systems are not equal. And by the way, if you want to have another war, much like we're doing in Ukraine now, that's what is happening with China. It's just a different means. And so when they talk about how equal we are and that we should use diplomacy, it's all a poison chalice. Maybe I won't be around enough to see it when it happens, but do remember my words when you're beholden to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was not a comment on cooperation, and I don't think mine is going to be a comment on cooperation either. Although I do think, I think Andrew laid out a sort of a very compelling picture of China's rise and China's prosperity. There is a dark side to this rise, right? As manifested in the United States through things like testimony by U.S. intelligence officials that China has taken the equivalent of 7 times the Library of Congress's worth of information in terms of intellectual property theft. Things like if you guys want to Google it, things like the 1,000 Talents program, in which China is exploiting scientific contacts to qualitatively leap ahead, right? And you can make the case that China is doing this for its self-interest, for the advancement of its own people, for its international standing, right? And this is totally legitimate on a pragmatic sense. However, the way China is doing it, the way China is engaging in this practice, has fundamental national security risks for the United States, and there are risks that are beginning to be taken seriously. And I would argue that for all those of you from this region, from the Middle East, from elsewhere, the level of Chinese involvement carries the same risks in your governments as well, right? It's up to your governments to decide how much penetration that you want. But please understand that it's not a risk-free relationship.
Well, I would just agree with what Mr. Berman just said. I mean, I think that it is something that all countries of the world are going to have to consider is how much, I don't think you cannot engage with the second largest economy in the world. And I do agree that China has taken a lot of technologies, but that was part of the agreement that they had to allow countries to come in that you'd have to share. I would disagree with China saying it's still a developing country. I don't think it is. Therefore, we don't need to share technologies anymore. But again, these are things that could be discussed, and I think all countries of the world need to come up with the idea of how much you want to engage, and if you're going to engage, as we've mentioned, at what cost. And sometimes, I guess in the United States, there are places called payday loans. People go to payday loans and they pay huge amounts of interest to get money because it's their only alternative to be able to pay their bills. And so I sometimes think about that in developing countries. So I would say that countries from democracies, countries from Europe and the United States need to be looking for ways that we could present alternatives to countries so that that it's at least a level playing field on being able to feel as empowered, as I don't know what the word would be, but that there's an interest from the liberal democracies of the world, as much of an interest as there is in China in being involved. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And very briefly, and then we have to close up, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that there are obviously grave concerns on both sides. At the Western side, the United States obviously worry about these side effects of Chinese rise, if not the entire purpose of Chinese rise, including intellectual property and human rights and so on and so forth. But on the part of China, there's a relative lack of concern of the Western concerns. So doing more of the same by pulling the two countries apart, this would be a downward spiral towards the Thucydides trap, and then encompassing not only the both countries but the rest of the world. So I do support a dialogue platform. It's not just a rhetoric, say, oh, let's talk, you know. I mean, that's empty. There ought to be a kind of formal model. Don't forget that there is a strategic economic dialogue at the time of the Obama administration. That's fallen by the wayside. But I think that there needs to be a movement, slight in the beginning, from competition more towards cooperation. Not to give up competition or rivalry, but more towards competition. And on the Chinese side, more towards addressing some of the concerns in the United States. And then these sort of things that need to be thrashed out in what I would call a comprehensive strategic dialogue. Not in a formal sense, not G2, but it's informal, it's a non-structural, and then multi-track, including formal officials and informal think tanks, people-to-people discussions, and involving other countries as well, because the relationship impact on so on Morocco, on the Middle East, and Africa, Latin America, but they need to be a multi-track kind of thing to thrash out some of these ideas, but to double down on more of the same, as if China is going to have a regime change, is totally unrealistic. And if the United States can impose its will on the rest of the world, it's equally unrealistic.
Thank you very much to this great contribution to all the speakers. Thank you very much for attending this session. Good afternoon.